Hello everybody, I'm Xand and welcome to my kitchen. Today we're going to be starting the process of making a sourdough starter from scratch. A sourdough starter is essentially a combination of flour and water that's left to ferment over time and can be used in place of commercial yeast to leaven things like breads and pastries, etc. We'll get to all of those eventually, but today we're just going to get started with getting this thing going. So before we dive in, I do just want to say that what I'm going to show you over the next few days is the process that I used to get my sourdough starter, Yeasty Boys, started a couple years ago. It was written by Maurizio over at theperfectloaf.com. It's my #1 resource for all things sourdough related, be them recipes or techniques, and I'll link it in the description so you can check it out. Let's talk about our equipment. First things first, we need some glass jars. These glass jars are really nice for this. They're from Weck, and the reason they're great is because they have this nice tapered straight edge, which makes it really easy to get things in and out of them and like scrape around the sides without having to deal with the lip. The other thing that makes them great is these lids. So when you buy these, they do come with a rubber airtight seal, but you can remove that and then the glass just sits perfectly on top and allows enough air in and out of that jar so that fermentation can happen. If you can't get your hands on one of these, which would be understandable, you could use pretty much any jar. You just want it to be quite large. This one I think is about 850 mils. You want something in that range because your sourdough starter, if you're doing it right, can actually bubble up to the top of this and even out. If you're going to use just any normal jar, they'll mostly have a screw-on lids. You don't want to screw them on, you just want to rest them on top. Alternatively, you can use some cheesecloth or a clean tea towel, just drape it over the top with an elastic band to keep it in place. Then a spatula, a silicone spatula specifically, because it obviously has that flex that helps you get around the edges of the bottom of the jar to make sure that all your flour is getting hydrated. They're also super easy to clean and don't break. And then lastly, a digital scale. This is a very ordinary garden variety digital scale. You don't need anything fancy for this. It's just got readings in grams, and grams are the thing that we need to measure everything in. When it comes to baking, grams are king. I don't want to hear about ounces or milliliters, or especially not cups. Cups are the worst measurement for anything, but particularly when it comes to flour. An added sort of bonus thing that you could use if you have one or you can afford one is an instant read digital thermometer. The reason for that is it's quite helpful to know what temperature things like your water, your dough itself is, because there is a sort of optimal range of temperatures in which fermentation happens, and that usually ends up being around sort of between 25 to 29 degrees Celsius. But if you have a relatively good sense of the weather and the temperature in your kitchen, it's not vital that you have a thermometer. Now let's talk about the ingredients. Some water. When it comes to water, you can just use straight up tap water. However, it's important to know how chlorinated your city's tap water is. You can find that out in most cases by going onto the municipal website. They should say whether there's chlorine in there, whether there's chloramide in there, chloramine. If it's chlorinated at a relatively high level, all you need to do is put a jug of water out overnight, and most of the chlorine in the water will dissipate overnight, and so it's ready to use the next day. Chloramine, on the other hand, is a little bit tougher to deal with. If your city does use chloramine in the water, I know it's not the most environmentally friendly thing, but I would buy some filtered water. I live in Cape Town where we have pretty good tap water most of the time, and I'm also fortunate to have a filter on my tap, so I'm pretty confident in the quality of my water. So I actually haven't done anything to this, I've literally just poured it straight out my tap. Then the flour, we've got white bread flour and we've got rye flour. We're not going to use the white bread flour on day one just because rye flour is more microbially active, so it's going to help us jumpstart the process quicker. we'll introduce this on day 2 or 3. But when you are adding the white flour, I do highly recommend either a bread flour or an all-purpose flour. Definitely avoid cake flour. The reason for that is bread flour and all-purpose flour have higher protein content, and that will help the development of gluten. And when it comes to sourdough, gluten is everything. In South Africa, you don't really find all-purpose flour. You're more likely to find bread flour, and that's actually a good thing because bread flour is the one with the highest protein content. To help you understand the science of what's going to go on in that jar, essentially in any flour there are naturally occurring yeast and bacterial spores, and when flour comes into contact with water, you get a process by which the enzymes in that flour start digesting the starch, which produces sugars. That whole process gives off gas, and that's what gives sourdough starters and sourdough breads their rise. It's the same thing that happens in commercial yeast, just on a slower sort of time frame, and that slower time frame has sort of implications on taste, on texture, and on sort of digestibility of the bread. That's why some people who report being gluten sensitive say that they can eat sourdough no problem, because the fermentation process makes that gluten easier to digest. Let's get into it. So we're going to start by getting our jar onto a scale. You want that jar to be as clean as possible, and you just want to zero it out. We're going to add 125 grams of water. It is a bit chilly, so I actually warm this water up to about 26 degrees centigrade. That's just going to help the fermentation happen. If it's cold where you are, I suggest doing that. And then we're going to add 100 grams of rye flour. Okay, now that we've got 125 grams of water in there and 100 grams of rye flour, just going to use our spatula to mix it up and make sure that all of that flour is completely hydrated. And that's kind of it for day 1. We're going to seal this with the lid. I'm going to put this in a bowl because it can actually bubble over on the first fermentation, and that'll cause a bloody mess. And as I said, it's a bit chilly where I am today, so if it's warm where you are, you can just leave this out on your counter. If it gets direct sunlight, that's cool, because the warmer the better. I'm just going to put it in my oven, but with the light on. Some ovens have a proof setting. If you have one of those, that's a great thing to use, because it just makes sure that the environment in there is warm. It'll sit around 27 degrees, which is kind of in that optimal range. So this is going to go in the oven for 24 hours, and we'll see how it does. Okay, here we are on day 2. It's been 24 hours since we put the flour and water into the oven with the light on. Let's see how it's done. Whoa. Okay. No shortage of activity there. Let's get that out of the way. Okay, so we can see that lots has happened overnight. And we can see that it's had no issue getting the fermentation process started. We can actually see a little bit of hooch forming at the bottom. And that is essentially moonshine. That's a clear alcohol that is generated by the fermentation process of yeast. And it tends to indicate that your starter needs to be fed. Whew. Okay, that's right. Be aware that your starter is not going to smell great for a while. Yeah, it's very sickly sweet. That's all the sugar being produced. Yeah. Whew, okay. So what we're going to do today is we are going to discard most of this. That might sound wasteful, but it's just what you have to do in the beginning. And we're going to refresh it with some flour and some more water. We can see that it's having no issue jump starting the fermentation process, so we're going to do 50-50 rye flour, white flour today. So we're going to get our scale and a fresh jar, and we're just going to zero it out. And first things first, we're going to add 75 grams of this. Before we do, we're just going to stir it down to to make sure we got sort of a good mix of everything in there. So you can see how much gas is in that we like, by stirring it down, we basically halved the size of it. So we're just going to do 75 grams. The rest of that we're going to discard. Then we're going to do 115 grams of slightly warmed water, because again, today is a little bit chilly. And then we're going to do 50 grams each, fresh spoon, white flour and rye flour. Okay, now that all of our flour and water has been added, I'm going to use our spatula again. Just going to make sure that this is all well combined and all of the flour is completely hydrated. That's that, it's mixed. Now all we're going to do, we're going to seal it again gently with the lid. We're going to put it back in its bowl. And it's going back into the oven with the light on for another 24 hours. Okay, here we are, day 3. It's been in the oven with the light on for another 24 hours, so let's see how we've done. Okay, that's different, obviously, to yesterday, but there's nothing to be worried about here. We can still see that it's been fermenting. There's a little bit more hooch that's formed at the bottom, and if this is what happens to you on your 3rd day, do not be discouraged. It's really important that no matter what you see in this jar, unless it's like black mold, but that really shouldn't happen, but no matter what you see in the jar, you really just have to stick with it and keep feeding it. Otherwise you're never going to get anywhere, because there really are going to be some days where it looks like nothing happened, or it looks like something wrong has happened. So it's important to just persevere. Today we're essentially just going to do exactly the same thing we did yesterday. Now it's going back into the oven with the light on for another 24 hours. See you tomorrow. Okay, here we are on day 4. As we can see, not a massive amount of activity in the jar there, but as I said yesterday, that's no reason to be discouraged. It's really important that we just keep on going. Today is the first day that we're going to do 2 refreshments in one day, and we're going to do one now. It's about 8:30 in the morning, and then we're going to do another one about 12 hours from now. We're going to be refreshing it with the exact same ratio that we've been doing before. Okay, that's our first refreshment done for the day. Back on with the lid and back into the oven for 12 hours. Okay, it's been 12 hours since the last feed. It's 8:30 p.m. on day 4. Not a huge amount has happened in here, but that's okay. We're essentially fighting a battle between good bacteria and bad bacteria, and we need to keep feeding the good bacteria flour and water so that they can win that battle. So, same thing as always. Okay, back into the oven for another 12 hours. It's the morning of day 5, and it's been 12 hours since we last fed this starter, and we can see it's risen and fallen just ever so slightly, but more encouraging than that is all of the little bubbles that we can see throughout the starter. What we're going to do over the next 2 days is the exact same thing we did yesterday. 2 refreshments a day, 12 hours apart. By the end of that process, this should be ready to bake with. Okay, you're about to see a supercut of me doing that exact same thing every 12 hours for the next 2 days. I'll see you at the end. Okay, it's day 7, which is our last day of building the starter technically. You would have just seen that it rose and fell beautifully overnight. I've just refreshed it again, and I'm going to do it again in 12 hours. But what we're doing differently today is that we're changing up the ratio of flour to starter and water. We're going to keep the same amount of flour, so 50 grams each of white and rye flour, but instead of 75 grams of starter and 150 grams of water, we're going to reduce that down to 50 grams of starter and 100 grams of water. And what that is doing is testing the maturity of the starter. If a reduced amount of starter and water can process the same amount of flour, that means it's reaching maturity and it's almost ready to bake with. So we're going to stick this in the oven for 12 hours. We're going to see how it rises and falls, and then I'm going to refresh it again tonight. And if it does the same rise and fall overnight as it did today and last night, then we can be confident that this is ready to bake with. It's day 8 and we've got ourselves a mature sourdough starter. As you would have just seen, it rose and sank really beautifully and consistently yesterday, and that tells us it's ready to bake with. It's an incredible thing to put some flour and water in a jar every day for a week, and at the end to have an active and stable starter that can serve you for decades. In terms of what to do next, from a feeding perspective, I like to stick to the 100 grams of flour. I continue with a mix of white bread flour and rye flour. You can basically do anything now. You can go whole wheat, you can do all white flour, you can do all rye flour if you want. But in terms of a day-to-day maintenance routine, I would say every morning, discard down to 50 grams. Don't throw that discard away. A future video will talk about what to do with all that discard. You can throw it away if you really need to and you don't have anything to do with it. But discard down to 50, feed it with the flour and water, and just make that a part of your daily routine. If you're not going to be baking frequently, you can put it in the fridge for a couple weeks at a time without doing anything to it. I would say the upper limits of that are like 2 weeks. You can probably push it further, but I would prefer not to. I've left this in the fridge for a couple weeks and then just brought it out and just fed it twice a day for a few days, and it's got back up and running quite quickly. The last thing I'm going to say is don't give up. Persevere. Even if it looks like nothing is happening, just stick to the routine, keep feeding it, and I promise you it will eventually get there. So now that we have an active sourdough starter, there's only one thing left to do, and that's bake some bread. Click up here if you want to watch me do that. I know that was a long process. If you're still watching, thanks for sticking with me. If you make your own sourdough starter, please let me know on Instagram. I'll be super happy to hear about it. Again, thanks very much for watching. See you in the next one.